We're now in part 2 of the first of what will probably be 3 sidebars in this series. In part 1 of this sidebar, I talked about thinking of your in-the-room decisions in the same way that a wrestler thinks of the various combinations of moves that he might string together in a match, or as chess players or debaters or negotiators think of gambits. At the end of part 1, I mentioned 5 example gambits that I myself have found useful when it comes to the challenge of establishing a culture of response. The wait, the stickler, the yes you do counter, the reel, the double take, and said I would talk about those in more detail in part 2, and that is where we are now. This is not an exhaustive list, and in a lot of ways, the way I personally think about how best to execute these gambits has to do with my particular skill set. It would be disingenuous for me to presume to be too prescriptive because each teacher ultimately needs to play to his or her strengths and piece together the moves that suit those strengths. I like the analogy to wrestling a bit more than I do the analogy to chess. In wrestling, there are some moves for which you have the right physique, and some that are more of a stretch, but which you can add to your repertoire if you are willing to experiment with them and hone their execution. One other way in which I prefer the wrestling analogy to the chess analogy is that, unlike chess, teaching and wrestling are not turn-based games. Bilaterally in the case of wrestling and multilaterally in the case of teaching, the moves are simultaneous. Exactly what actions follow from what contingencies is a lot more nuanced and not so conveniently mathematical. So these gambits don't necessarily break down into step-by-step procedures that work unfailingly. What I am trying to do here is not necessarily to prescribe formulas that will always work for everybody, but rather to model the concept of thinking formulaically, thinking your way through a gambit. If you watched part 1 of this sidebar, you may recall that I recommended articulating a gambit in terms of if and then clauses. Let's look at each more closely now. Here's our first gambit, the wait. If a student is silent in response to a prompt or a question from me, then I will wait. When I observe teachers, one of the ways that I can tell that a teacher is not just passing through the profession, but is committed to it, is that he or she has this ability to wait as long as he or she has to get a response. The reason why that's a real flag for me is that the kind of waiting that an ESL teacher needs to do in order to get the students to speak up and take risks is a lot longer than people usually wait in a conversation amongst fellow native speakers.
Making fun of the guy's birth certificate issue when it was never a real issue, except from the right wing.
You think Mitt Romney's playing the race card?
When he said,
no, I'm asking you, do you think he's playing the race card?
There's no doubt he did with his birth certificate.
No doubt.
No doubt. Why would he bring it up? Why would he say I have no problem with my birth certificate? What's that supposed to say?
Because he's an awkward joker.
Because he misfired badly on the joke.
Why would he do it?
In everyday life, we decide on how long we are going to wait by balancing A, the need to give the other person space to express him or herself, against B, the need not to be guilty of creating awkwardness. But in teaching English as a second language, the imperative that you give the other person space to express him or herself far outweighs the awkwardness imperative. In fact, speaking just for me, I would say that there are a lot of situations in the room with the kids where I very deliberately create awkwardness as a way to draw a particular student towards the behavior that I want. In another sidebar, I will talk more about why it is that the wait in the Japanese ESL context can be so long. But before I move on to discuss the next gambit, here are some principles that you want to bear in mind when it comes to executing the wait. First, no shy passes. I often hear teachers describe their kids as, quote, shy. Again, here is where the imperatives that govern regular day-to-day interaction between people, that kind of politeness, contrast with the imperatives that govern a language lesson. As a general principle of politeness, when you encounter someone that is reluctant to communicate, you are supposed to give that person space, not press that person to communicate in a situation where perhaps that person does not want to communicate. But taking that attitude in the Japanese ESL context almost always means that they never step up and meet you halfway. That is to say that giving one kid a shy pass simply results in the shyness spreading to the rest of the class. Second, win the first time. Call on the right kid. This is tough, but try to figure out, as the class is just getting started, which kids are likely to respond. Maybe look to see if one kid is being particularly boisterous, or if there's a group of kids that are already interacting with you in some way as the class gets started. There are usually one or two. Show your grit. If you encounter reluctance on this first person that you call on, stick to your line of attack and really give that student a chance to come around and muster some sort of response. That first kid is key. The wait for that first kid you call on is likely to be triple the average wait for subsequent kids that you call on. You are basically establishing a precedent. Third, you will lose sometimes, but don't let losing be a pattern. If you call on 2 different kids in a row that give you no response, be suspicious of the prompt that you are using. See if you can modify your prompt to make it easier. If you get a stone wall 3 times in a row, shift to something completely different, and then see if you can work your way back to the prompt that had failed. That is, don't train the kids to respond to you with silence. Stay with the patterns of stimulus response that enforce responsiveness. Break the patterns of stimulus and response that enforce unresponsiveness. The stickler. If a student answers with a sentence fragment, then I will insist on a full sentence reply. I think of all the Gambits, this is the easiest to implement if you haven't already. It's simply a matter of making full sentences a policy, an expectation, and holding to it consistently. Now, not every teacher I talk to agrees with me on this point because in real-life English conversations, we often use glib, truncated, or one-word responses to each other that are heavily dependent upon context.
No.
You did, just then.
No, nonsense.
Oh, look, this is futile.
No, it isn't.
I came here for a good argument.
No, you didn't. You came here for an argument.
Well, an argument's not the same as contradiction.
Can be.
No, it can't. An argument's a connected series of statements.
I'm not going to try to counter it here, but I will say this before I move on. If you do allow single word or truncated replies, make sure that you do not negotiate yourself into a position where that is the only thing that you are ever able to get out of the kids. The yes you do counter. If a student says, I don't know, and I suspect he or she is actually capable of something more than that, then I rephrase the question and or put clues up on the board. I will insist that he or she at least guess at a response. This is a variation of the wait. Instead of simply answering your question with silence, a student has learned that he or she can get you to move on to someone else more quickly by saying, wakanai, or I don't know. The problem is, at least in Japan, that often if you let one student pass by saying I don't know, pretty soon you are dealing with a room full of kids that claim not to know the answer to any question that you ask. Often the student does not believe that he or she knows the answer, when in fact he or she does know the answer, but has fallen into the habit of feeling clueless with regards to all things English. It's good to develop a repertoire of hints, or in the study of applied linguistics, what are often called scaffolding techniques, to bridge that gap between what the student believes he or she can do and what he or she actually can do. The real. If a student answers in a soft voice or mumbles an answer, I will pull away from the student and insist that the student speak loud enough to hear. This is a constant struggle, particularly in a culture like Japan where boisterous abandon is frowned upon. The problem is compounded, however, by a cross-cultural principle of communication where our natural tendency, when someone is speaking softly, is to draw close to the person and mirror the quality of the person's voice. That's fine if you are engaged in polite conversation with someone, but in the context of an oral communication lesson, it's analogous to diving into the ocean after a fish that refuses to come into the boat after having taken the hook. It does nothing to encourage the fish into the boat, and it makes it easier for the fish to dislodge the hook. So resist the temptation to draw close to a student that is responding quietly to you. Reel back from the student like you've just hooked your fish. Move your body towards a position in the room that is as far away as possible, and insist that the speaker communicate loud enough for you to hear at that distance. I would say that in my case, the real gambit accounts for perhaps 75% of my motion around the room. That is to say, usually if I'm moving from point A to point B, I'm trying to reel in a student. First moving just close enough to hook the fish, and then reeling back to draw the fish towards a more communicative posture. The double take. If a student guesses and gets it wrong, then I will express glee that he or she mustered a response, but I'll also correct the error and come back to that student with a similar prompt and give the student a chance to get it right. This fifth gambit has to do with following up and rewarding a student's willingness to meet you halfway. You want to fully exploit the response that you get to deepen and broaden the student's experience of success. The two key elements to executing the double take are glee and follow-up. Glee is pretty simple. You need to show that you are happy about having elicited a response. Good. Yes! Everybody, Tom is older than George. Response can come in lots of forms. When you get a response from a particular student, be conscious of what level of proficiency the student is demonstrating, and moderate your follow-up accordingly. So let's say for the first 10 minutes of your lesson, you are able to get no response whatsoever from anybody. And finally, you hold up a picture of a Hawker 900X. And one kid says, "Hikoki." You express glee, and then follow up by getting the student to say it in English. If a student says jetto, you might follow up by getting the student to say, "It's a jet." If a student says, "Oh, I want to," you express glee and get the student to say, "I want to have a jet," or "I'm going to buy a jet." Exactly what kind of follow-up you push for depends on what the targets for this lesson are and what the pedagogical objectives for the long term are. It's a matter of heavy debate amongst foreign teachers in Japan how much grammar and usage correction we should be doing. The concern being that Japanese students in general are already terrified of making mistakes. That is one problem that they have, but another problem is that they learn words and grammatical structures without knowing what they sound like when a native speaker uses them. You are one of the rare chances they are likely to get to hear and produce these sentences as they are supposed to sound in real life. So in my case, I moderate how I do corrections depending upon the disposition of each student, but I usually do correct in some way. And it is essential, if and however you do correct, that you come back to the student later in the lesson and give the student the chance to get it right, to experience success. In part 3 of the sidebar, I'll touch upon the importance of ARMP, authentic rhythm, melody, and pronunciation.